All right, we're going to be debating, does a soul exist? And Eric, you got 15 minutes on the floor, so all on you, my friend.
All right, so I'd like to first thank James and Modern Day Debate for the invitation and to Leo for participating in this debate. Now, the question for this debate is, does a soul exist? And I want to start by giving you two things this debate is not. To begin with, this debate is not a scientific question, and this is the case for a few reasons. First, to say otherwise would be a category fallacy. The soul, if it exists, would be a non-physical entity, and science, by definition, is a discipline that can only study the physical. Thus, while science is a wonderful tool for investigating the physical world, it has nothing to say about the non-physical. In fact, science in principle cannot even ask the question, much less answer it. And some of the world's leading neuroscientists, such as the late Nobel Prize winner John Eccles, Jeffrey Schwartz, and Mario Beauregard, all believe in the soul, and one can't say they believe in the soul because they don't understand the neuroscience, given that these are some of the world's leaders in neuroscience. Moreover, any view regarding the nature of consciousness or the soul, be it dualism, my view, or physicalism, Leo's view, will be what is called empirically equivalent, meaning that there is no piece of empirical data that one could give that would specifically lend support to one view over the other. Put differently, Leo and I will agree on all the empirical data, but our conclusions drawn from the data will be philosophical in nature and not scientific. This is because the questions surrounding tonight's debates are philosophical questions about metaphysics, not science. And as atheist philosopher of science Michael Roux says, science does not ask certain questions, so it is to no surprise that it does not give certain answers. So appealing to science to answer the question tonight would be like appealing to a ruler to measure your weight. It is simply the wrong tool for the assessment. Second, this debate is not about the correlations between the mind and brain. Well, there's much to say here, and I'll touch more on this later. Suffice to say that no dualist denies correlations, but again, we can get to that in our interaction. Let's start with the definition. What is a soul? The soul is an immaterial substance that possesses consciousness and animates the body. That is to say, the soul is a self, the conscious subject. And with that being said, my case for the soul will be argued in two basic contentions. The first is that consciousness is not physical, that is to say, neither identical nor reducible to anything physical like the brain. And two, that I am more than a brain and body, I am a soul. Now, in order to understand the arguments I'll be providing for these two basic points, it's important to get a foundation and grasp of what is known as Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals, but for short, we'll just call it the law of identity or Leibniz's law. According to Leibniz's law, if two things in question are the same, say some A and B, then whatever is true of one is going to necessarily be true of the other and vice versa. So in philosophy, when we say two things are identical, we simply mean they're the same thing. And this gives us a test for identity. Because if in principle, you can show that there is something true of one that is not true of the other, or vice versa, then it follows that the two are not the same thing. So with this in mind, we can go to my first basic contention, that consciousness is not physical. And let's say for the sake of argument that Leo is correct and that physicalism is true, which is a view that human beings are purely physical objects composed of purely physical properties and parts. The reason this is important is because if Leo wants to argue that physicalism is true, then he'll have to demonstrate to us that consciousness, if it exists, is identical or reducible to something physical like the brain. And given in Leibniz's law, this would mean that whatever is true of the mind must necessarily be true of the brain and vice versa. However, if he cannot demonstrate that this is the case, and in principle, we can show that there is something true of the mind that is not true of the brain, or vice versa, then given Leibniz's law of identity, it would follow that consciousness cannot be identical or reducible to the physical, given that they possess different properties, and thus physicalism would be false. And while there are many ways to show the non-identity between the mind and brain, for the sake of time, I'll just list a few. First, take the state of my mind, like my thoughts or beliefs. My thoughts or beliefs could be true or false, but no state or region of my brain is true or false. Now, Leo takes a functionalist, physicalist view of the mind, in which mental states are reducible to functions of the brain. But note how the same problem arises. Again, my thoughts can be true or false, but functions aren't true or false. I don't even know what it would mean to say that a function is true or false. After all, a toilet flushing is a function, but toilet flushes aren't true or false. My brain can be 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or taste of a banana, which is in my mind, is not 7 inches long. Moreover, my mental states are accessible only to me, whereas my brain states are not. For example, a doctor can open up my skull and look at my brain, but she doesn't open up my skull and look at my thoughts. This is because consciousness is a first-person, direct, private, or privileged access kind of thing, accessible only to me. So while a neuroscientist can know more about my brain than I do, she could never know more about my mental life than I do. In other words, she can see my brain functions, but she won't see my thoughts. Now, while there are many more examples we can go through, the point is simply this. If all the properties of the brain are physical, and all the properties of the mind are not physical, well, then it follows that consciousness, if it exists, cannot be identical or reducible to the physical, and if it cannot be identical or reducible to the physical, then it follows that physicalism is false. Now, at this point, it would be crucial to pause and make everyone aware of the fact that establishing a cause or dependence relationship between two things is not the same thing as, nor does it establish identity. To illustrate, suppose a guitar player pops a string while he's playing the song and is no longer able to continue playing the music. Note how it's easy to establish a cause and effect or dependency relationship between the musician and his instrument, but clearly this wouldn't prove that one is identical or reducible to the other. And similarly, it's easy to establish that you affect parts of my brain, such as with Alzheimer's, narcotics, or brain damage, it will have a cause and effect correlation with the functions of my mind. But as before, this wouldn't prove that the mind and brain are identical to each other, because as I just mentioned, cause or dependence relationship is not the same thing as, nor can it establish identity. So if Leo wants to show that physicalism is true, he's going to have to do far more than show that there's a cause and effect or dependency relationship. At the very least, he's going to have to show that they necessarily share the same properties, and that is that there is nothing true of the mind that is not true of the brain, and vice versa. And unless he can do that, then his belief in physicalism is unjustified. Now, another thing to briefly mention is the irreducibility of consciousness, which I won't have time to go into detail, but consider what the following three atheist philosophers have to say regarding the issue. Atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel has pointed out in his book, Mind and Cosmos, that you cannot get mind from matter. The problem is that you can't simply rearrange particles of matter and get something like consciousness coming into existence any more than rearranging the red bricks of a house will give you the color blue. In other words, consciousness is not something that you get by simply rearranging a physical structure. Hence, atheist philosopher Thomas McGinn says that any naturalistic explanation for consciousness coming from matter would border on sheer magic. And note that to simply point out correlations or call consciousness emergent or supervenient doesn't solve the problem either, because as atheist philosopher Jaegwon Kim would argue, correlations are not explanations, but are in fact the very thing that need explaining. So slapping the label of emergent or supervenient only gives a name to the problem, but it doesn't solve it. Now, using Leibniz's law of identity once again, let's look at the second point, that I am more than a brain and body. To begin with, let's suppose again that Leo's correct, and that physicalism is true. If this is the case, and I am identical and reducible to nothing more than a brain and body, then human beings would be what we call in philosophy a mereological aggregate, but we'll just call this an aggregate for short, which is a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. So things like watches, cars, or Lego bricks are what you would call aggregate. Again, a collection of several parts held together in a structure. But it's important to note that for aggregates, their existence and identity necessarily depend on their parts and structure. To illustrate, consider this car. If I were to replace the tires of this car, would it still be the same car? But before you answer that question, suppose I were to replace every single nut and bolt of this car, every part, windshield, bumper, is it the same car? But before you answer that question, suppose I took those replaced parts, put them back together, and you'll now have two cars. And then we could ask which of these two is the original, if any. Now, regardless of your answer, one thing is clear, and that is that for aggregates, they do not retain what is called identity through change or part replacement. So with this in mind, consider my first argument. Premise 1, I'm either a purely physical object or an immaterial soul. 2, if I am a purely physical object, then I do not retain identity through change. As a thought experiment, suppose I committed a crime 7 to 10 years ago. It's now known through science that every 7 to 10 years, human beings replace virtually every cell in our bodies. Well, suppose a detective comes at my door and says that they just now found the evidence to convict me. But clearly, I couldn't argue that the person they're looking for no longer exists because that's a different set of properties and parts. Why? Because we all intuitively know that we do retain identity through change and part replacement, and thus it would follow that therefore I'm not a purely physical object, therefore I am a soul. Or consider an argument put forth by secular philosopher Jaegwon Kim. He says something like, in 2011, this brain and body did not exist. However, I did exist in 2011, therefore I'm not identical or reducible to a body. The second, indivisibility of personhood. Premise 1, I'm either a purely physical object, an aggregate, or an immaterial soul. 2, purely physical objects can be divided and exist in various percentages or degrees. To illustrate, if I were to cut a table in half and burn one side, it would make sense to say that I have 50% of a table. But the same cannot be said of me. For example, if you were to cut me in half, say my arms and limbs, note that while it would make sense to say that I have 50% of a body, it wouldn't make sense to say that therefore I am 50% of a person. And yet this is exactly what it would have to mean if physicalism is true. Moreover, consider the fact that men are typically larger than women. If physicalism is true and personhood is grounded in something physical, and if we grant value to persons, then this would have to imply that having more mass and matter would mean that you matter more. But clearly this is absurd. Men are not more valuable or more persons than women. And note how the same thing can be said of the brain. Consider something like Dandy-Walker syndrome or anencephalic disease, or operations where some people are missing, say, 30% of their brain. But note this wouldn't mean that they're only 70% persons. They're still 100% persons that have lost function, but personhood isn't grounded in something physical like your functioning. Thus, I cannot be divided or exist in various percentages or degrees. Therefore, I'm not a purely physical object. Therefore, I am a soul. Next is the argument from free will. Premise 1, I'm either a purely physical object, an aggregate, or an immaterial soul. If I am a purely physical object, then I do not possess free will. Now, concerning free will, I am more specifically talking about libertarian free will, which can be defined as being the first mover of one's will or actions. That is to say, you are not caused to act or will by something prior or external to yourself. However, if naturalism is true, then as secular philosopher Jaegwon Kim argues, the law of causal closure of the physical must be true. And according to this law, no physical event has a non-physical cause. Consequently, this would entail that on physicalism, every thought, decision, belief, and behavior was causally determined by physical events external to and beyond one's control. Put differently, this would mean that if Leo rejects free will, then his very decision to be a physicalist was not necessarily the result of rigorous research and freely following the evidence where it led and freely coming to this conclusion, but rather it was something he was causally determined to believe by prior non-rational factors beyond his control, and he could not have believed otherwise. So if one gives up free will, one must pay the intellectual price tag of giving up two things, namely moral responsibility and intellectual integrity. This would entail that if there is no free will and determinism is true, then there would be no foundation for moral responsibility or intellectual integrity for any belief that he holds to. Yet, if human beings are morally responsible for their actions and intellectually responsible for the beliefs that they hold to, and freely following the evidence where it leads, then it follows that we do possess free will, which means that therefore I am not a purely physical object, therefore I'm a soul. Now I will say that if Leo wants us to believe that he freely came to be an atheist or physicalist based on the intellectual reasons, and if he believes that people are held morally accountable for their beliefs and for what they do, then human beings cannot be identical or reducible to purely physical objects. So, in conclusion, I provided two contentions for the existence of the soul in answer to tonight's debate, does the soul exist? And these were: one, that consciousness is not physical, and two, that I am more than a brain and body, I am a soul. And we can summarize the case as follows. One, the non-identity of mind and brain, that if consciousness exists, it can't be physical. And for the second point, identity through change, that is that if you're the same person from one moment to the next, and if everyone is equally valuable, despite the amount of mass or matter they possess, then they are indivisible as persons. And if people are morally responsible for their actions and rationally responsible for their beliefs, free will, then it would follow that physicalism is false. So here's the irony for tonight's debate. The fact that Leo is arguing for physicalism tonight automatically presupposes, note, that one, everyone here is conscious, that two, you'll be the same person at the beginning, middle, and end of this debate, three, that everyone here is equally valuable, and four, that everyone here is free to follow the evidence and freely change their mind on the topic. Which means that even if you're convinced by Leo's case that physicalism is true, then ironically, this would only mean that the soul exists and therefore physicalism would be false. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you for that. We're going to kick it over to Leo for up to 15 minutes for your introductory statement, and thank you, everybody, for being here. The floor is yours.
I don't know if I'll need the full 15 minutes, just a few points of contention I have immediately with the concept of the soul. One of them is actually brought up and talked about by Jaegwon Kim, who Eric mentioned a number of times. I believe he calls it the causal exclusion problem or the pairing problem. And it's this idea that if the soul, as Eric has already conceded, is a non-physical thing, then the soul is ignorant to spatial proximity. And the question then is, why can my soul only affect my brain body? Why can't I not affect Eric's brain body, or Ryan or Jane's brain body, or any of you? After all, if the soul doesn't care about spatial proximity, then it shouldn't matter the brain body. The soul can affect it. But that's not what we observe. Another way you could look at this is, say that you had a leg amputated. If the soul is ignorant to spatial proximity, it shouldn't matter that your leg is not physically connected to your body. Your soul should still have some control over your leg. Another thing that we do not observe. And for me, this issue I find to be a big deal with things like substance dualism and the soul, that we can only affect our brain bodies and only in an intact way. The second problem that I have is more of a causal problem with the concept of a soul. How does the soul causally interact with the world? How does my soul cause me to raise my hand? And if the soul doesn't causally engage with the body, then how does it cause the body to do things? How do things happen because of my soul, if not through causality? I would argue physicalism has an explanation for both of these points. Number one, I can't affect my leg if it's been amputated because I don't have a soul. I just have my physical body and my physical brain and all of the various functions and processes that it engages in. You separate apart from that, you no longer have any control over that part of your body. I can't affect anybody else's body because of physicalism, because this is me. I am a brain body, but I'm not just that brain body. I am all of the various functions and processes that it engages in as the whole system metabolizes throughout my life. And physicalism can explain how things happen causally, because causality, at least according to most metaphysicians, is going to be considered some sort of physical process happening through time. So I can raise my hand because of the physical signals going on in my brain that transfers to all of my nerves that then affect the muscles that cause the changes in my arm to raise up. So physicalism seems to account for these two problems where I don't see, at least yet, how a soul can account for these issues that I have. And my final issue is that the soul seems a bit superfluous. As Eric has already admitted, the soul isn't a physical thing, and it isn't an empirical thing either. We can't use empirical science to understand what the soul is. So for me, all that means is that the soul as a concept, as a thing, if you will, does not immediately harmonize with the ontology of the world around us. It doesn't fit in with physics, it doesn't fit in with chemistry, it doesn't fit in with biology, or any of the other means through which we could understand the world and how all the things that happen in it, like us raising our hands and driving our cars and doing all of the actions and the behaviors and having all of the beliefs and the desires that we do, doesn't seem that it can account for that. And to me, that just means that it seems kind of like a useless concept. The concept of the soul doesn't provide for meaningful causal explanations of what is going on in our bodies and in our brains. It doesn't serve as an explanans for anything. It doesn't seem to fit into some sort of theory that we can use to explain things and predict things going forward into the future. Also, when is the soul obtained? When do we get our souls? When we're conceived? 2 months into carrying a child? When we're born? Some point after we're born? When do we get a soul? What kinds of creatures does a soul obtain within? Do dogs have souls? Do cats have souls? Do fish have souls? So these kinds of questions seem to show a level of sort of vagueness or vacuousness to the concept of a soul, which I would argue lends to its superfluousness. This again might be strong, its uselessness in helping us understand the world around us. So for me, I look for things that we can use to actually help us explain and understand the world around us. And it just doesn't seem that a soul is a concept that is going to be useful in doing that. And I think it is for that reason that the concept should be rejected. And that's all I have to say.
All right, excellent. We're going to kick it into an open discussion. So 50 minutes on the floor, and usually I'm sorry? Oh, yes, and also, if anybody in the room is having a munch, we just ask if you can hold on until after our discussion. So 15 minutes, and I'll usually hand it over to you, Eric, where you just listened to all that. So for some response.
Yeah. So thank you for the opening. It seemed that so as my friend Cameron Bertuzzi, you may know of Capturing Christianity, likes to say, questions are an argument. So I didn't hear an argument as to the soul not existing or a stance the soul doesn't exist. I heard a lot of questions of, well, how does this happen? I think the first thing I'd say, and then feel free to, whenever you want to respond, is that you're essentially looking at epistemic questions of how something works, as opposed to the case that I'm providing is an ontological answer to how we know that there is a soul to begin with. So, for example, my son uses an iPhone, and I can assure you he doesn't know how it works, but it doesn't follow from that therefore there is no iPhone. So I don't see how, even if I said I don't know to all your questions, how would that prove there's no soul?
I think it would show that, well, the soul is superfluous. It can't really offer any explanations for anything. If we don't know how the soul affects the body to do things, if we don't know why the soul can only affect a single brain body, then that just seems that it's not saying anything more. It's not providing us with anything over and above the physical mechanisms that we already utilize, at least I shouldn't say that the neuroscientists and all of them already utilize to understand these kinds of actions and behaviors that we engage in.
So are you conceding that all those questions don't prove that there is no soul?
Don't prove that there is no soul,
or
no.
Don't
but
give evidence
they
to
weren't
it.
just questions. I mean, there's the pairing problem, which you seem familiar with Jaguan Kim, so Jaguan Kim, Jaguan Kim. I've heard it both ways. I don't know how it's pronounced. And then the interaction problem, which states that it is a question. Does the soul causally interact with the brain body?
I would say yes.
Okay.
But
how?
Going back to, I want to make sure that this point is clear. That again, if I say I don't know, note how that doesn't affect any of the arguments I gave, because the arguments I gave were that there. So if I can read a quote from J.P. Moreland and Brennan Rickowell's new book, The Substance of Consciousness. In answer to that kind of causal explanation question, they say substance dualism is not intended to provide a causal explanation for the occurrence of conscious states. Substance dualism is an ontological theory as to what sort of thing must an entity be to capture adequately several features, not of mental states, but of the thing that has them. In other words, I'm not giving an epistemic answer to here's how this works, but rather that if something like the mind exists, it would have to have a subjective center of consciousness that possesses it. So all the questions you're asking, and feel free to take it where you want from here, I just want to make that point clear that none of that would affect any of the arguments that I made.
So I'm a little confused on some terminology. Can I ask what you mean by subjective center of consciousness?
That I'm a subject, that I'm a conscious subject.
Okay, I mean, I would agree with that, but I don't think that can only be true under a substance dualism, which maybe you weren't necessarily saying that, but...
I think so.
You think so? You don't think that you can be a conscious agent under physicalism?
I don't think so, no.
Why not?
So what's interesting is one of the things you brought up was that that substance dualism doesn't harmonize with what we know about the world.
Mm-hmm.
Now what's interesting is, so you believe consciousness exists, I'm assuming?
Of course.
Okay. So are you familiar with eliminative materialists?
Yeah, I am not an eliminative
right.
materialist.
So, but they would give the very same argument that you just gave as to why we should eliminate conscious entities, because they are in no way harmonizing with anything physical.
I think they do.
Okay.
I think they harmonize with the various neurophysiological processes that occur within the central nervous system. I think that's what consciousness is. And it seems, and this is why I asked a lot of those questions, that from what we can understand within the field of neuroscience, that's what it's showing us. That we can go into the physical brain, change things about it, and that changes the sort of mind that people have. We also have split brain patients. There's a guy, I can't remember the guy's name, but he's split brain, and he's both an atheist and a theist, and both sides of his brain can argue with each other. I would wonder how the concept of a soul would account for something like that.
Right, so we're going back to accounting questions, but I want to take one thing at a time here. I'm trying to think of the first thing you brought up. You're talking about, so you're saying that the mind just is the brain, then I would love to hear...
No, I don't think the mind is the brain. I think the mind emerges from the neurophysiological processes of not the brain, the central nervous system. Because I think all of that is important to our consciousness. Even the neurons in our gut have been shown to be important to our consciousness.
So note that at the beginning of my opening, I said there are two things this debate is not a scientific question, and it's not about the correlations of the mind and brain. That seems to be the very thing you're arguing. Now, granted, we didn't exchange openings, But I think it's telling here that I think most of the arguments against substance dualism are really strawmen that don't address the actual issue. Two physicalists, Nobel Prize winners who are physicalists, they don't believe in the soul, they're naturalists, Francis Crick and Christoph Koch, they acknowledge that one of the main attitudes among neuroscientists is that the nature of consciousness is a philosophical problem and so best left to philosophers. So even the neuroscientists are saying it's not a scientific problem, and I don't even see how in principle neuroscience could settle anything. Now, again, I would agree that there are correlations, but I've already addressed that in my opening, so I don't see how that would do anything to anything that I presented.
Two things there. Not just that, I mean, I do think you were doing this, no offense intended, but people making those statements seem to me to be ad hoc dismissing science as having any place in this discussion. I just think that's false. I think that science has and can and has said a lot about consciousness. There was another thing I wanted to say. What was the second thing you said after that first point?
And by the way, if there's anything, because there's a question you asked I haven't answered, so I don't want to. I want you to think I'm trying to dodge those.
Yeah.
What you say was the second thing? From what I remember, it was just that the main attitude of neuroscientists. So in other words, it seems like you're disagreeing.
Oh, I remember the correlation thing. I would agree with that general principle that correlation doesn't equal causation, but I would say that causation is correlative. So we can use correlations to understand causative relations. So I don't think that you're really doing this here, but I do oftentimes think the whole correlation causation thing can be abused. Again, I don't really think that you're doing that here. But just to reiterate, correlation does not equal causation. I agree with that completely, but I think causation is correlative. And I think that when those correlations are strong enough, such as if I hit somebody in the head with a bat 100 times and all 100 times they get knocked out, I think it's reasonable to say that hitting somebody in the head hard enough can knock them out, that there's a causative relation there. And I think that the correlations between what the brain and the central nervous system and even other parts of the body are doing correlates so strongly with our consciousness that we can say that consciousness has a physical basis of some sort.
Okay, so a few things. Because I'd still be curious to what the mind is on your view, but it seems that you disagree.
The mind is what the central nervous system does. The way that I would just answer that.
I'll answer it a little bit differently. Well, let me go ahead and ask that now. And my argument wasn't that correlations aren't causation. My argument was that establishing a cause and effect or dependency relationship is not the same thing as establishing identity, but you seem to agree that the mind is not the brain.
No, I do not. I don't hold to identity theory.
Okay, so how do you identify a mental state?
I'm not really sure what a mental state or even a physical state or something like a quantum state is, because I believe that the whole of physical reality, including us and everything going on inside of us, is processual. So the whole states thing, looking at things at states as sort of this definite, instantaneous instant, is something we do. It's sort of a convention that we do. But states don't exist in reality. So for me, I'm not sure what a mental state is, but I'm equally as unsure to what a physical state would be as well, because the state language confuses me. So I'm not sure what a mental state is.
So you believe we have thought?
Yes.
That would be a mental state.
Well, I would consider those mental processes rather than state.
How can a mental process be true or false?
I don't know what that means.
How can a process be true or false?
Well, I don't think it is. Just like the processes in the sun aren't true or false either.
Right. So that was one of my arguments, was that the mind and brain aren't identical, and I appealed to your view of functionalism.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to say that the mind or that the mind is a function of the brain, well, my thoughts, which is a mental state, can be true or false, but a function isn't true or false. So that would automatically show that they're not the same thing.
Of course, the content of your thoughts can be true or false, but I'm a nominalist, so that content doesn't really, like, it's not.
Well, I think you're thinking propositions. I'm talking about the thought itself. So thoughts exist, and they're grounded in thinkers.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to the philosophy of mind, the two main questions is what is the nature of mind or mental states, and what is the thing that possesses it? I argued that consciousness is not physical and it's possessed by an immaterial substance.
Mm-hmm.
On your view, the mind is a process of the whole system, is what I hear you saying,
mm-hmm.
and it's possessed by what?
That's that system and its process.
Okay. So
that question I have to think about in the sense that being possessed by, I don't know if that's the language I would use, but just for the sake of the discussion, I would say possessed by the system and its various processes and functions.
Yeah, so then, so how would you respond then to my argument of the non-identity between a process and a mental state, like a thought or belief?
I don't see an issue there, I guess.
So the mind is a process of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
Mental states, like a thought, can be true or false. Processes can't be true.
If the thought is propositional, I don't know what it would mean for something
Let's say it is.
non-propositional to be true or
Let's
false.
say it is.
But for me, that's going to be the content, not the thought itself, but the content of one's thoughts. So you can have thoughts, and then I can have thoughts of. And if I have a thought of something propositional, that propositional content would be true or false. But obviously, the processes and functions which produce it would not be. Just like it can be true or false that the sun emits electromagnetic radiation, but the processes that produce all of that electromagnetic radiation are not going to be truth functional. So
I don't think you're doing this intentionally, but I think you're making it more complicated than it needs to be. I have a thought, grass is green.
Mm-hmm.
That can be true or false.
The proposition that grass is green can be true or false.
And my
yes.
belief that grass is green.
Can also be true or false.
Right,
yes.
but the process, the brain process, is not true or false.
No, of course not.
So then how can mental states be processes of the brain?
I guess I'm not understanding where the objection is. I don't know why the processes would have to be truth functional just because the content of the thoughts is truth functional.
Because if you're identifying a mental state as a process of the brain, then whatever's true of that mental state would have to be true of the brain state if they're the same
Why?
thing. Because that's how identity works.
Well, I don't take identity.
Well,
I take functionalism.
When I ask you,
or process functionalism.
so when I
call it.
ask you how do you identify a mental state, or if I ask you is the mind a process of the brain, that word is I'm using it as an is of identity. So I guess I would just ask how do you explain?
Well, I would probably use it as an is of predication. We can predicate about the central nervous system that it produces what we call a mind.
So you are taking a reductionistic approach.
No, I'm taking an emergence approach.
So there's two types of reduction. It sounds like you're taking a causal reduction, which let's call it emergent. So it sounds almost, and I don't know here, so I'd be curious. It sounds like you're at least a property dualist if you're saying that you have. Okay, so can you define then what you are?
I'm what I call a process functionalist.
Can you explain that for me?
That what we call consciousness is the processes and the functions of the central nervous system in the body as the body continuously metabolizes throughout your life.
And
so if that metabolism stops, so do you.
Okay, so at best you're showing that there's a dependence relation.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. The consciousness depends on the functions and processes.
How do you know what sensations you're having?
I feel them.
Right. So you're not looking at processes. You're just introspective.
My perceptual senses relate to those processes and functions.
Well, I didn't say they relate. I'm still trying to get at the nature of a mental state.
That would be my view. Is that my perceptual senses relate to the processes and functions.
I agree with you there. I have, again, as I
said, I perceive through my the perceptual apparatuses that I have, which are a result of the processes and functions, and the structures like eyes and nose and tongue and ears. If I didn't have those, I wouldn't have those senses.
But going back, as I said in the beginning, no dualist denies that there are correlations or that the processes are correlated to that. So I don't.
But the soul is immaterial, right?
Yes.
So it shouldn't need eyes to see, right?
So is the mind. The mind is immaterial as well.
But the soul shouldn't need eyes to see.
Well, while
right?
embodied, I would think it does.
Why? I mean, it doesn't depend on the body. It's an immaterial thing.
I would say, but so where are you getting these notions from? I'm curious.
What do you mean?
So you were talking about like some of the questions you asked. Let's go back even to the beginning. If my leg were amputated, why couldn't my soul interact with that? Or why my soul with this body? And then you're saying that what was it you just said, that the soul, why does it need to?
Yeah, why doesn't the soul? Why can't the soul still see even without eyes if the soul is non-physical?
So I think the soul can still see even without eyes, but that goes into.
So how come people are blind if we have souls?
Well, because they're embodied. So if you were to put me in a body.
But why does the body matter to a non-physical soul when the body is physical?
So this goes a lot deeper, which I don't mind going here. So I take a Traducian view of the soul. You ask when do we get a soul, which I don't think again is relevant to the existence of the soul. You're again asking epistemic questions, not ontological questions. But I suffice to say, I take a view of the soul. It's the soul that actually forms the body. So on my view, you're not going to have a body without a soul at conception, because it's the soul that's going to be forming the body. But let's say you put me in a car and you wielded.
What do you mean the soul forms?
So it's
I
a
would
view
think it
known
would be all the
as-
nutrition that the mother intakes that helps to build.
Right,
Like if
so-
the mother died, any fetus she was carrying would ultimately die as well.
Sure, right. But again, all you're pointing to are correlations, cause and effect, or dependency relationships, which I don't
Which I think is
disagree with.
enough to show that the concept of a non-physical soul doesn't really seem to provide
Okay,
anything. It's not telling us especially if it's non-physical, but then seems to be dependent upon some physical structures
Why
and
would
processes.
so I'm curious, why would that be a problem? How is that an argument?
Because the soul is non-physical. Something non-physical shouldn't depend on physical things to do stuff.
Why?
Because it's non-physical.
Now you're just being circular, you're being tautologous. Like, what's the argument?
That it's non-physical.
Right.
Non-physical things don't interact with physical things.
How do you know?
How would we detect a non-physical thing interacting with a physical thing?
You're the
We'd
one
have
making,
to be able to measure
but
that
you're the
to
one
know
making
that
the,
it happens.
You're the one
and
making
so
the claim.
We've never measured it, so I suspect
How would
it
we
doesn't
measure it?
happen. We measure physical causes and physical effects.
How
We don't
would
measure
we measure?
non-physical. How would we measure a non-physical? I have no idea.
So that, but you just said that it can't
I think
happen.
that's part of the problem.
But well, you just said it can't happen, and I asked you how. You said because you can't measure it. And I asked, well, how would you measure it? And you said you can't.
Yeah.
So you don't see that as
Because
circular.
as you mentioned, the universe is causally closed. I don't know
So
what
I
it
don't-
would
I don't
mean
think the universe
for
is
something.
causally
That's
closed.
fine. Show me a cause that is non-physical.
So again, so these are your claims. So you would bear the burden of proof here. And I think we're kind of jumping all over the place. I want to go back to, again, just because I still don't think I've gotten an answer to my first contention that the mind and brain aren't identical, or that the mind.
Well, I've already agreed with that point that they're not identical.
Right.
I could take a brain from like a laboratory, some medical laboratory. I don't have consciousness because it's not the structures obviously are important because functions and processes take place in the structures, but the structures themselves are not what matters when we're trying to understand consciousness, at least not fully. It's the functions and the processes that the structures are engaged in.
So earlier I asked you how you know when you're in a certain kind of mental state. You said you feel it. How would it not be the case that if consciousness is just a process, then how is it not that if I open up my skull, I could just see my mental state?
Is because you can't see neurophysiological processes. That's at a scale that humans don't.
So let's say we got
yet.
really good eyes.
We could see them with the proper technology to understand the various electrochemical processes and all of those neurophysiological processes occurring across the brain. If we could map that, we would probably, in fact, we have sort of looked at people's thoughts. Obviously, that language is a little flowery, but we know that we can put certain devices on people's heads. They can think of a word, and then the computer can display the word that they're thinking.
So, going back to my question, so you're saying you can see people's thoughts, and I know you said it was flowery, but that's exactly what I'm asking. So
in a sense, yes, we can see, we can detect in the brain what's going on that maps to what a person is thinking accurately.
I'm not asking about correlations. I'm asking about specifically the mental state. The mental state is a process. Then looking at the process would mean you're looking at the mental state. Yes.
Yeah, you're looking at those mental processes being carried out in the brain. You're watching the way that the ion channels and all that stuff are working. You would be watching consciousness.
Okay, so then we can see consciousness by looking at processes. So consciousness just is the process.
Yeah, consciousness is the processes and functions that occur across the central nervous
So then
system.
I go back to what I said in the beginning. How is it the case that they have different properties? My mental states don't share the properties of physical processes. How do you account for that?
What do you mean? Like, I can think of a unicorn even though a unicorn isn't physically real? Like something along those lines?
That's good. That
Because
sounds
we
fine to
can
me.
conceptualize things. We have an imagination.
Right, but that means that they're two different things. They're not the
I
same
don't think
thing.
it means that they're two different things. Well, the mind and the physical brain, I would say, are two different things, but the mind emerges from the brain and what it does.
Okay, so even if I grant that, and for the sake of argument, let's say I do, you still have two things at play. Something physical causing something else to emerge.
I would say something physical causing something physical to emerge. Or
Okay, so
emergence.
Can you
needs to be
name
understood.
one property of a mental state that's physical?
One property of a mental state? I don't know what you mean by mental state.
So
What is
I
a
would
property of like mental processes would be like the whole ion channels and all that stuff would be a property of mental processes. When you watch these processes play out, you're watching the mental process.
So the question of how do you identify a mental state is one of the most basic questions in philosophy of mind. You're telling me that you don't understand that. Now I'm not trying to point fingers or anything, but it's a complicated issue. I understand that, but this is one of those basic things where you have functionalists, token identity theorists, type eliminated materialists. So for a functionalist, now to be fair, some functionalists will say that they're not going to specify anything in particular. Nevertheless, it still seems that if you're going to call it something physical, which you have, you're going to have to show that they share the same properties.
Well, see, it seems that you're thinking there's two different things, a physical thing and then something else that needs to share properties with the physical thing. I'm saying, no, there isn't this other thing. There's the physical thing and the processes and functions that it's engaging in.
So going back to, so then consciousness is physical.
Mm-hmm.
And so I ask again, name a physical property that a mental state has. What I mean by a mental state, I would define consciousness ostensibly. And I would say there are 5 states of consciousness: thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and volition.
You said that those were states of consciousness?
Mental states, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I would consider those probably, would I consider those dispositions? I don't know. I would consider a lot like beliefs and desires and stuff like that as stances, and I think stances are also physical things in our brain that emerge from what the brain does. I don't think that like the mind is separate from the brain and all of the physical functions and processes.
I never argued that.
Well, I know that. I was clarifying my position.
But in other words, but I still don't feel like I've gotten any answers here. So maybe I'll let you ask me something.
I'm just curious how the soul explains what's going on in our head.
So again, as I quoted earlier, the soul is not meant as something to explain how. It's describing the properties of the mind and pointing to the kind of thing that would have to possess or ground it. So
if the soul doesn't explain, which is what it sounds like you're saying, why do I care? It doesn't seem like it's telling me anything.
Well, I would say first we should care what's true, right? Second, again, and I don't want to go through my whole opening again, but if consciousness is not physical, which so far I haven't heard an argument that it is, then it would need to be possessed by some immaterial substance. I don't see how brain functions can possess thoughts or beliefs.
Well, I don't think consciousness is something possessed. I think it's processual.
Well,
it's a process.
Course. So can there be thoughts that no one possesses?
Can there be thought? No, thoughts aren't something separate from a brain.
Okay.
And its processes
no.
And the consciousness that produces them.
So again,
thoughts aren't a thing out there that a brain grabs and uses or
I
something like that.
I agree. This is why I said there are 2 basic questions in philosophy of mind that everybody starts with in this field. What is the nature of consciousness and what possesses it? So by the fact that you say no, there are no thoughts that are just kind of floating out there. They have to be, what was the word you used? That they're a process of the brain. Then your answer, it seems that it's possessed by the brain. And then my question is, how does a thought, how is that grounded, possessed, however you want to hash that out, but those are both words used within philosophy of mind. How are brain processes thinking or having beliefs about things?
That's what the brain processes are. That's what thinking is. Thinking is those processes and functions in the brain.
Which can't be true or false.
Of course,
right?
They're processes. They're not propositional. They're not
but mental
propositions.
States can't. Okay, we've agreed mental states can be propositional.
Yeah.
Okay, can a process be propositional?
You can think propositions.
Can a process be propositional?
No, it's
okay,
not,
well then
it's
they're
not
not
a
the same
proposition.
Well
that's dealing with things like epistemology, maybe a little bit of logic. Of course, thoughts aren't going to be true or false. They're not propositional things.
Well, but
your phone isn't true or false.
Thoughts can be true or false.
The content of thoughts can be true or false.
So a thought can be true or false.
The content of thoughts
processes can't be true or false.
Of course not.
So that would automatically show that you can't reduce a mental state to a brain process.
I'm not coming from a perspective of reduction.
So it's a causal reduction or an emergent type
My
of reduction.
position is not a causal reduction. It'd be a causal emergence.
Okay, so in other words, there like I said earlier, 2 types of reduction. So let's just call it emergence. So let's go to emergence.
Well, emergence and reduction are not related to each other.
Okay, so how would consciousness emerge?
From the processes and functions of the brain. How exactly that gets to consciousness is something neuroscientists are still working out.
Okay, so I think this is a little bit ironic. You asked, how does this work of the soul and body?
Mm-hmm.
I asked you how consciousness emerges. You're basically saying, I don't know, which is fair.
Well, I'm not saying, the thing is, with what I asked you, I don't think there is an answer. With what you just asked me, I think there is. I don't know it. A neuroscientist would probably be able to explain how consciousness arises out of these processes and functions. I'm not a neuroscientist. I just don't have the answer to that.
And I think neuroscience is largely irrelevant to all these questions, which is the modern attitude of most neuroscientists who are writing on the topic. But okay, so let's go to that, the interaction problem. I agree with William Hasker, philosopher of mind, who says that the interaction problem is probably like the most overrated objection in the history of philosophy. Because 1, like I said, it's an epistemic question, not an ontological question. 2, it could be the case that the interaction between the soul and body is just basic and immediate. Because you can mean a few things by asking how the soul interacts with the body. One, you could be asking for an intervening mechanism. But I would say that would lead to an infinite regress, where how does A interact with B? Well, by way of C. But then you can ask, how does A interact with C to interact with B? Well, by way of D, and you get into an infinite regress.
Wait, wouldn't C be the way through which A is interacting with B in that example?
Well, but why couldn't you just ask for another intervening mechanism?
I mean, even if it's F, okay, so A interacts with B through F, then F is just the means.
And why would you just stop at 1 or 2?
Because that's all it takes to explain what's going on.
Okay, so then we could just say that it's a basic immediate action that's primitive, and A just
Well, I wouldn't consider
interacts
that primitive. I mean, you have A, B, and C. It's not just A does something to B through nothing at all.
Well,
which
okay, but
I
again,
would take to be primitive is that there's no sort of interaction going on.
So basic and primitive are also technical terminology. It means it's just immediate. There is no intervening mechanism.
Yes.
That's what it means for an action to be basic or primitive. So
there
that
would
could
be no C. There would be no means of interaction.
Right. So it could be that. It could also be the case that I've heard Moreland give the analogy of, let's say, that there is some type of energy perhaps created by the soul, but it's so minuscule in comparison to what's going on. So, for example,
then wouldn't it be irrelevant to our everyday lives if it's just so minuscule that it kind of doesn't matter?
No, I don't think you're understanding my point. So let me finish the illustration.
I'm sorry, I did
No,
interrupt.
that's fine. So suppose you could flip a switch that would release all the water in the Hoover Dam. Now, the energy it takes to flip the switch versus all the energy released by the water is so wide in comparison that the energy that it took to flip the switch is so minuscule. So I'm saying it could be that, let's suppose for the sake of argument, the soul does create some energy. The amount of energy it would take to release the amount of energy that's in my body would be almost undetectable, so to speak. So that could be one explanation. I've heard some people give explanations that there could be something similar to quantum entanglement, where you probably understand this better than I do, where you have two particles that seem to be causally related, and the distance is so far that there couldn't be an exchange of energy. It could be something like that. I've also heard that...
Wouldn't that make the soul physical if it's utilizing physical processes?
But that would assume that you have to be physical in order to interact with the physical, which I think is a question.
I would need to see an argument that non-physical things can interact with the physical.
Well, it's your claim, though.
There's never been anything. Yeah, and I would just say that conservation of energy and momentum, the second law of thermodynamics, sort of preclude non-physical things from interacting with physical things.
So those work for closed systems, and the causal closure or conservation of energy, I would say, are applying only to closed systems and purely physical systems. But that begs the question of naturalism and physicalism to begin with, which is a very
Why
thing.
would they be confined to only physical systems?
So this is what I've heard Moreland argue, and I've heard others argue on this. But essentially, that it's almost like a methodological naturalist kind of approach. Which I think is fair, all things being equal, but if we have reason to suspect there is something non-physical, well, then I don't think it would apply there. So far, just to recap on the interaction problem, I could say I don't know, wouldn't matter, because it's an epistemic question, not ontological question. It could be an immediate, basic, or primitive action. It could be that there is some energy created, and it's not a closed system, but it's so small it's almost impossible to detect. And I forget which philosopher even proposed that perhaps it doesn't create energy, it just... kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Maneuvers it, for lack of a better word. I forget the exact quote. But again, at the end of the day, I think there are fair answers to it. But even if I don't understand how, it goes back to, if I don't know how my car works, doesn't mean my car doesn't exist.
Of course, but I don't think souls are like cars.
Me either, but I think you're arguing the illustration, not the point.
Well, I don't understand the usage of cars there, I guess, then. If
The
souls
fact
are
that
so dissimilar from cars.
Because now you might not be arguing this, but as I can perceive it, it sounds like you're implying if you cannot answer how this works, then we maybe shouldn't believe it exists.
Well, but this is the thing. Who out there does know how the soul does this? Because there are people who know how cars work. There are people who know how phones work. There are people who can answer those questions. Who can answer them for the soul then?
So the answer is yes, that is what you're arguing, right?
Can you repeat it?
It sounds like you're arguing if we don't know how something works, then we shouldn't believe it. Is that what you're arguing?
No. I don't think that because some individual does not understand how something works that they shouldn't believe it. But if nobody can even remotely figure out or have a starting point for how something works, I think that's cause for question.
I've given you 3 or 4 starting points that have been proposed for the interaction. And I've also,
Of the soul?
and to reiterate, this is an epistemic question, not an ontological question.
I still don't think
So-
that makes it unimportant
So
to the discussion.
still haven't heard an argument. I've heard more questions, but I would like to focus on some things I've argued. So one of the things I argued was identity through change,
Mhm.
right? Do you think that people remain the same throughout part replacement and change?
Yes and no. I mean, I don't think I'm the same person I was when I was 4, but I think I'm the same person in some probably like maybe a legal sense or something like that.
Okay,
Like
so
I'm still Leo Filius. I was Leo Filius when I was 4. I'm Leo Filius now, but different beliefs, different desires, different aims, different stances. You know, people talk about this all the time. They're a changed person. I think that can happen. I think people can change, and I
So-
think they can become different
so they're
persons.
talking about in the loose popular sense of identity. But
Unless
given,
by person you're meaning, sorry to interrupt, something more like concrete, then I would say,
Yes.
yes, I'm the same person.
okay, so you do believe people retain identity through change in a
Yes.
concrete, absolute
Yeah,
thing, right?
yeah.
Because it's a debate on philosophy of mind, so
That
that's
was the word I was originally looking for, was,
Okay.
was concrete.
right on. Okay, so how is that possible in your view?
How is it possible that people remain the same? I don't see any immediate contradiction, and if there's no immediate contradiction, then I can grant that it's possible.
Okay, so if there is no soul, and we are, how would you define the I guess? When you refer to the I, what are you referring to?
Some amalgam of experiences and probably some like intrinsic genetic biological factors that are developed over time through a person's experiences of the world.
So-
Builds this notion of the self, of the I.
So if those things change, you wouldn't be the same person.
Not in the concrete sense, no.
So then you don't think persons retain identity through change and part replacement?
In the concrete sense, yes.
Yes, you don't think, or yes, they do?
Well, in this more concrete sense, we are the same person. We have the same names, the same family members, all that stuff. The various features of our persons can change.
But I'm asking persons in the absolute sense. Persons are concrete. Are you the same person in the absolute concrete sense that you were when you were 4, or am I looking at a different person that exists and the person that was 4 years old no longer exists?
I mean, the second one kind of intuitively does seem true to me because of how I look at the world. But I would say that concretely I am the same person. I have the same name. It's been me living the same life. I have the same mom. But I don't have the same various positions and stances and beliefs. I don't look at the world the same way.
But those aren't essential to being a person. So I guess let me ask.
I think maybe not essential. That one I'd have to think about whether I think they're essential or not. I don't know. I'll agree tentatively for the sake of the discussion
Agree what?
that those are not essential to a person.
All right. So then it would be kind of pointless to name those things have changed, right? Those would be accidental properties, not essential properties.
Okay.
So why did you name those as changing? What would that have to do with whether or not you're the same person?
What have to do with whether I'm not?
So I asked you if you're the same throughout part replacement, and you started saying, well, I have different beliefs, different desires, A, B, C, and D. We just agreed those weren't essential, so what was the point of mentioning those?
I don't know. I'd have to look back and think about why I brought that up and look back in the discussion because I'm
Fair
sort
enough.
of in the moment moving forward.
No, fair enough. So what is it, I guess, that would ground this concrete identity change?
I don't know if it would be grounded, but probably reality. The reality that we inhabit, the fact that we exist, the fact that we continue to exist.
But I'm asking, how, on your view, do we retain identity through change or part replacement? So
Well,
let me,
I don't even understand why we wouldn't, I guess. Why wouldn't we?
well, if you're just a purely physical object, I would say that aggregates don't retain identity through change.
Why not? Wait, so if I had a cup of water and took one molecule of water out of it, it's not the same cup of water?
If mereological essentialism is true, sure. But let's look at it like, okay, let's take a tricycle. A tricycle, by definition, is something with 3 wheels.
Mhm.
If you remove a wheel, you could say that in a metaphysical sense, a tricycle has ceased to exist and a bicycle has come into
Yeah,
existence.
that's analytic because it's true by definition.
Fair enough. Nevertheless, it shows us that aggregates, their existence and identity, this is something I briefly mentioned in my opening, necessarily depend on the parts and their structure.
Well, if it's defined analytically like a tricycle is, then yes, I would say it depends necessarily on having 3 wheels.
So
But I don't think all of the properties are going to be analytic.
So I think, again, you're arguing the analogy, not the principle, but let me grant that. So you're familiar with the ship of Theseus.
Mhm.
Sure. So I use an example of a car. So would you say that it's the same car Or at what point does it cease to be the same car? How many parts will have to change before it's no longer the same car?
I don't know if you would make it necessarily a different car. I think identity has a lot to do with us and how we identify things rather than being contained in the thing itself. So if I bought a car, I don't know, a 2004 Ford Taurus, and then it was blue, and then I painted it red, that's the same car. I don't think making it red makes it a completely different thing altogether. It's still that one same Ford Taurus that I purchased.
So going back to, so I'm asking ontologically, I would disagree that identity is more about us, because if no one existed, the law of identity would still exist, that
I don't think
something
so.
is identical to itself. So if we did not exist, things would cease to be identical to themselves?
That law wouldn't exist. The law is an abstraction convented by humans. What it may refer to might still exist, but just like people who say the laws of logic would still exist even if we didn't. No, they wouldn't.
You don't think they really?
No, that we convented the laws of logic.
We invented the laws of logic?
Convented the laws of logic.
Can you
We
explain that?
abstracted them out of our understanding of things around us as a formalized system of thought. We didn't exist. I mean, this thing isn't going to just magically turn into an apple, but the law of logic that we invented that talks about that and formalizes that as a system of thought wouldn't exist.
So let's look at a physical law.
Mm-hmm.
If everyone in the world today died, would gravity cease to exist?
Of course not.
Okay, so then laws
But the theories of gravity would, certainly.
So laws can continue to exist. And laws describe something in reality.
What the laws describe, I think, can, but the laws themselves are abstractions.
So I don't know what you mean by the laws themselves. Are you talking about like the words?
Like the content of them. Like gravity would continue to exist. The law of gravity would not. General relativity would not, because humans made those.
It sounds like you're using an idiosyncratic use of the word exists, because I'm not talking about like the phrase, the law of identity. I'm talking about
Neither am I. I'm talking about that concept as developed by humans.
I'm not asking about the concept. There are certain laws.
You're asking about identity then. Do things, would this, if humans didn't exist, say this laptop still did, even though humans made it, it's just a hypothetical, this laptop would still be this laptop. It'd still be identical to itself.
Right, because nothing's going to break the laws of logic.
Well, the laws of logic are invented by us. But yeah, I agree that they don't break. They're generally considered universal and necessary.
Okay, so going back to, so this is why I'm saying I don't think identity is about us or how we perceive things. We're trying to describe reality, the ontic, the ontology of reality. So going back to the aggregate thing, at what point, how many parts of a car do I have to replace before it ceases to be the same car?
I don't think it would necessarily cease to be the same car, but I think it just depends on who you ask. Some people might say if I put bigger tires on it, that's not the same car.
But clearly,
I would say that it is.
Clearly, reality doesn't depend on who you ask when it comes to those kind of things.
Well, certain features of reality don't, and I think that certain others do. And I don't know if I would consider identity to be a feature of reality or more something that we talk about with respect to it.
Okay. So in my thought experiment about replacing the tires, would it be the same car?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Just like if I changed the oil, it's the same car.
So replace every single part, same car?
Yeah.
So if I took the replaced parts, put them together, two cars, which is the original?
Which is the original? Well, the original would be the one if you took all the original parts that were replaced and put those together, that one would be the original car.
But earlier when I asked you if I replaced the tires, that one was still the original car.
Well, no, it wasn't the original car. It was still identical to itself.
Okay, right, but identity, so it's still that car, which means the original.
Well, that one, but once you take all of the original parts and then replace them with new parts and then take those original parts and build that car again, you've rebuilt the original car.
So if we
and
stick
then that
to
one is identical to that one and this one is identical to this one.
So at what point in replacing the parts of this car did it cease to be the original?
Did it cease once you replaced all of them?
So
and then rebuilt the other car. So if you just replaced all the parts and then did nothing with them, that's still the same car.
Okay, so I don't see how identity would have to be dependent on something external to itself, and identity is an intrinsic property.
I'm not going to say that it isn't. I just don't know if I agree if it is.
Well, that's what you're saying. That's what would have to be implied by what you're saying, because you're saying that this car would still be the original unless I put the replaced parts back together. Then it somehow ceases to be the original in virtue of this one's existence.
Original, yes, but I don't think originality and identity are the same thing.
So if something is the same, it's going to be the original. If we use original car as it is the same thing as in philosophy of mind,
car
identity,
identical to itself?
Yes.
Okay, then no, it's not original because it's no longer identical to itself because this one has all the new parts, not those original parts of that car sitting over there.
Right.
So that one's the original, and that one is identical to itself. This one is now new, and it's still also identical to itself. Now, if they're the same exact car, they would be identical to each other. There would just be a haxity between them.
There would be one car There'd
Well,
be
there
only
would be
one
two,
car.
because you have the one built
But
from
you
the original
can't have
parts and the
something
one built
identical
from
to
the new
two
parts.
things. Everything's
didn't
identical
say
to
that.
itself and not something
Yeah,
else.
of
right?
course. Well, you can't have two things that are identical. An electron and
No,
another
we're-
electron are identical
We're
to each
using.
other.
I feel like you're using the word identical in an idiosyncratic, non-philosophy of mind jargon kind of way.
Well, I would probably use it more in the way that a metaphysician would use it,
Well, that's
rather
why
than
I'm
a
using it.
philosopher of mind. And
Well,
if I had two
metaphysician-
electrons, one in this hand and one in this hand, they're identical to each other. They possess the same properties.
That's not so. Law of identity is a basic one of the three basic laws of logic. Leibniz says law of identity is also a basic law, and that's how identity is typically used almost virtually any and everywhere. So I don't see how.
Well, things can be identical to themselves, but I also think things can be identical to other things that share all the exact same properties. There would just be a hierarchy between them, a thisness between them. So like I was saying, I can have an electron in this hand and another electron in this hand, and they're identical to each other. There is no property about them that will differ.
You're using identical in a non-philosophical way there.
I don't think I am.
So are they literally the same?
Yeah, there's just a hierarchy between them. A thisness that separates them is still being, there are still two electrons there. They're just identical to each other.
So these two separate electrons
Mm-hmm.
are literally the same electron.
They're not the same electron, but they are
That's
both
what identity
identical
is.
to each
Well,
other in that they are electrons.
That's what's meant by identity.
I don't take
literally the
identity.
same
I
thing.
just don't take identity to mean. I think two things with all of the same exact properties are identical
That's
to each other.
how it's used in philosophy.
That's fine. I know philosophers that don't use it that way. In fact, I know quite a few that don't use it that way.
Can you name some?
I'm not going to. I don't really feel comfortable sharing their names.
Okay.
That's just because they're also online and do stuff online, and I don't know if they want me to share their name.
Okay, fair enough. So I'm still not sure if you think persons retain identity through change or part replacement. Absolute strict identity through change.
I think so. If my leg got decapitated, I'd still be who I am.
Okay.
Just be legless, or, well, one legless.
Sure. So then that would show us that our personhood isn't grounded, our identity isn't grounded in the physical body, correct?
I mean, if I removed every part of my body, I would say I wouldn't even be me anymore, because I probably wouldn't even be human at that point. I'd just be an amalgamation of matter sitting on the floor, of organic matter. It used to be a human. It used to be me sitting on the floor.
So at what point are you no longer the same
Once
person?
all of my parts have been removed.
Okay, so at what point while you're still alive are you a different person?
Once all of my parts have been removed. There
How
isn't,
can you be
well, I don't
alive?
think there's a hard line where that's going to happen other than once it's been fully, completely changed. Because if something's been completely changed with brand new properties, of course it's not going to be identical to the thing it was before.
Well, it is if you have something underlying that change, like an immaterial substance.
Underlying change?
Yes.
I'm not sure I understand that phrase.
Underlying change.
Yeah.
So I would actually argue that change presupposes sameness. So when an apple goes from sour to sweet, there is something underlying that change that is exchanging these
Okay, I
accidental
think I might get
properties.
there's something that gives rise to the difference over time.
Yes.
Yeah, that
Right.
would just be physical changes in the apple. It's chemical structure.
Right.
I would still call that the same apple.
I would too. But what is it that underlies the change for human beings?
What is it that underlies change for human beings? With the physical changes we go through. Because our age, us aging, all that stuff. Those are the changes that we go through. They
So-
happen as a result of us, well, entropy and us aging and going through our life.
So you mentioned Jaguan Kim earlier. I'm curious what you think about his argument for identity to change. That
I don't know anything about his particular argument from identity.
well,
to
it's the one I
change.
mentioned. He says in 2001, this brain and body did not exist, but I did exist in 2001, and that's an argument. Now I don't know if he's proposing it as he's explaining some of the traditional substance dualist arguments. So would you agree that your brain and body didn't exist in 2001, but you did?
My brain and body? No, my brain and body existed in 2001. I was alive.
Not this one. Not the one you have now.
Well, of course. Well, depends on how you look at it. Because in 2001, I was like 5 going on 6, I think. My body was smaller, different proportions.
Did you exist?
Hair might not have existed in certain places at that time, like on my face. That's what I'm referring to.
That was nice.
All right.
I like it. That's good.
So if you mean same as in identical to that structure of that body in 2001, then no.
I mean, did you exist as a person in 2001?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was born in 95.
Wow. But did
Did
the
you just
body
say
you
wow
have?
as if I'm old?
No, as if like you're young.
Oh,
So,
okay.
yeah.
That's a compliment.
Yes. No. So you did exist in 2001,
Mhm.
but the brain and body you possess right now did not exist in 2001.
If by brain and body you mean that brain and body in that
The
structure
one that you
at
have
that
right
time.
now.
The one that I have right now
Yes.
in this time, that it wasn't the same one as the one in 2001 because the one in 2001 was smaller and different in proportions.
And
Yeah, I
because
would
we
say this
changed
is a
virtually.
different, more, I don't want to use the word evolved. People might go to biology. I don't mean it that way. I think you understand what I mean. This is a more evolved version of that thing.
Right. So then that would show that we're not identical or reducible to brains and bodies.
We're not identical or reducible to brains and bodies, as in we, as in that self or that I.
Yes.
I mean, I think we are. Reducible to brains
But you can't
and
say
bodies.
you can't.
Maybe not, because the brain and the body is not in and of itself consciousness, and I would say that what we are is consciousness. We might be
We are. Oh, I'd love for you to unpack that. We are consciousness. What do you mean?
that the self is just your consciousness and the amalgam of your experience. Like I said earlier, the amalgam of experiences.
Well, you said earlier it was
beliefs,
a brain
desires.
process.
That consciousness is the process, but the self, the I, the who you are, is that consciousness and everything that it experiences and develops over time. That's why people can change over time.
Let's talk about emergence.
Okay.
Now, to be fair, you've already said you don't know. I would argue that you're not going to get consciousness squirting into existence by rearranging physical matter. This is something, Thomas Nagel, one of the world's leading influential philosophers of the past 50 years, was an atheist in his book Mind and Cosmos.
Why wouldn't we be able to?
How could you? So a few things.
Well, the same reason that we can get temperature from atoms, but atoms don't have temperature themselves.
So here's what I'm getting to. You want to talk about emergence. First, emergence would be brute facts. And I would say now you're bloating your
I
ontology.
think that depends on how one looks at emergence.
And well, by definition, emergence would be some kind of sui generis property that is unlike the base parts. So that is something that you can't predict, first of all. That's how emergence was initially defined. Something you can't predict, something that's not within the base parts. You wouldn't even know that it was there to begin with. But I would argue that you can't get that on naturalist ontology. At best, you're going to get structural properties, not emergent properties.
Well, I would argue some of those structures are emergent. Like temperature is an emergent property.
Structural.
Structural emergence is still emergence.
Okay, but there's a difference between supervenient emergence and structural emergence. Now, if all you're going to argue is structural, I'm fine with that.
One can argue both, that there's both structural and supervenient emergence.
Specifically with consciousness.
I would argue that's probably, would that be I would argue it might even be both, but probably structural.
Right, well, okay, so I would grant that because I think you can only get structural. But I think that's the very problem. How do you get consciousness, which is so unlike the physical, emerging from just rearranging physical matter?
That I don't know. Again, I'm not a neuroscientist. I might even be tempted to ask, I actually like that question. But I myself do not know.
So that is literally the hard problem of consciousness, right? And you have a lot of, like I said, interestingly, the very questions you were asking are talking about how the soul is so unlike harmonizing what we know about the physical universe is the very reason you have eliminative materialists, people who just deny consciousness, but you're not one of those. And it's also the reason that you have now people, what's interesting is a shift that's happening in philosophy of mind where even naturalists are now, I would say, punting to panpsychism because I think it's becoming more and more clear that you're not going to get consciousness from rearranging physical matter. It's the hard problem of consciousness. So the best thing you can do, this is what Thomas Nagel advocates for, is some type of panpsychism, that consciousness probably was there to begin with. The interesting admission I think they're making is that consciousness is fundamental.
I'm going to be honest, I don't know if I would agree that panpsychism is sort of taking over amongst naturalists. Naturalists I talk to are like, panpsychism, their words, not mine, is kind of dumb. So
It's a book that just came out maybe this month, Substance of Consciousness by J.P. Moreland, my guy, and Brandon Rickabaugh. They talk about how there's it's growing in philosophy of mind.
I think I might agree with that within philosophy of mind, there are a lot more people, a lot more interested in panpsychism. But I think, honestly, that's been a lot more theists as they run from substance dualism, because
Theists?
I don't think, yeah.
No, the ones I can think of are not theists. And I don't see why a theist would have to go to panpsychism when at the core of our belief you have an unembodied mind. In other
What
words,
is an unembodied mind?
what is an unembodied mind?
Yeah.
God.
Okay, so that was an example. I was looking more for a definition. I probably should have specified that.
It's I would say an immaterial substance that's not embodied.
So what is an immaterial substance?
Good.
Those two words do just genuinely seem to butt heads with each other, so to speak.
Well, I don't think so. I think the reason people think that is because they're not familiar with the history of philosophy. The word substance was first coined, if I'm not mistaken, by Aristotle, and he was talking about immaterial things, because a substance just means to sub, which is below, stand, so it's to stand under. And Aristotle used a word to point to the thing that was standing and possessing and unifying properties, which is another thing I would say you need a soul for ontologically, to unify and ground all one's properties and parts. So a substance is the thing that stands under the property. And when Aristotle coined the term, again, he was talking about immaterial substances. So it only butts heads if you're not familiar with how the term arose to begin with. What is an immaterial substance? I would say it's a continuant. It's a first mover. It's a thing that unifies its properties into one class. It's something that is, if you want to go here, the difference between substances and something like a car, which would be an aggregate, is that for substances, they exist ontologically as wholes prior to their parts. For aggregates, the parts exist prior to the wholes, and I'll explain that briefly. If I were to take a tire from a car, the tire remains a tire, which means it retains its identity independent of the whole. By contrast, if you were to sever my arm, it would cease to be a human arm, as Aristotle said. It would lose its identity, which is evident by the fact that it would decay in a few days and cease to exist. So for substances, you have the whole prior to the parts. For aggregates, you have the parts prior to the whole. Now, an immaterial substance is a thing, again, that unifies. It's prior to the whole, grounds and unifies its properties and parts. It's a continuant. It's in its most simple class. You don't need to identify it by something lower than that, because it's a thing that, and I see they're coming up here, it's a thing that unifies everything from your unified visual field, which I didn't even touch on, the thing that possesses your...
Which I have heard you talk about before, so I am somewhat familiar with that as is.
Unified visual field, it's a thing that grounds your identity through change, the fact that you're a person and it's irreducible, and the fact that you have libertarian free will, which we didn't even get to touch on, but it looks like we're about to get interrupted.
Oh, no, you're not going to get in any trouble, but we are going to move into the Q&A here. So thanks for the discussion, fellas. What we're going to do is we're going to get everybody to line up here in front of that plug there, that last plug. So if you have questions, just make a little line here, and we're going to get them rolling. I think you are...
Hopefully there's more questions for me this time, because there wasn't in the last.
Young fella, mic's all yours.
Hello, I'm Ozian.
Hi, Ozian.
How you doing, Leo and Eric? So I did have a point of contention with one of the claims he made, is that all parts of the human body replace themselves every 7 years. That's not true. Different parts of the human bodies replace themselves at different periods of time. Specifically, the brain does not replace itself as far as we know, so our neurological central nervous system. And so does that change your opinion on identity if your identity is those, like he's describing, sort of like your central nervous system and the beliefs you had? And to go back to Leo, the heart does have approximately 40,000 neurons.
Oh, it does?
Yes.
I didn't know the heart had any. I knew the gut did.
It sort of has its own central nervous system that if the heart was replaced, that part of the central nervous system would be replaced. And people make claims that they feel like they're different people. Whether that's true or not, we can't really confirm. But if that is the case, does that change your opinion about identity?
So the question you asked me, note I was careful with my language. I said your body replaces virtually every cell every 7 to 10 years. And you're right, your brain does not replace cells. But given something like neuroplasticity, your brain can wire differently when it loses certain parts of it. What's also interesting is I think neuroplasticity lends credibility to the soul, that it's not just a one-way causal street. If you affect my brain, you affect my mind. Because of something like cognitive behavioral therapy, we have also seen that the soul can actually affect parts of the brain. If you think differently, then you can actually change the chemistry of your brain. And this is something that Jeffrey Schwartz, one of the world's leading neuroscientists, has showed.
Neuroplasticity is actually very, very, very interesting. I wanted to say to what you said, though, this is just more of a comment, because it was actually a neuroscientist that I was talking to that said, instead of saying brain, say central nervous system. And I think it's because there are neurons in the heart, in the gut, and I think even in some other places in the body that are actually quite important to the functioning, not just of the body, but do help with the functioning of consciousness itself. And that's why I've started referring to the whole of the central nervous system rather than just the brain itself as an organ.
All right, your question.
Thank you. And really great discussion. I appreciate both of you. I'm trying to differentiate, based on your definition, how a computer that I can replicate from one side of the globe to the next, how it feels to me like by your definition, it must have a soul.
Yeah,
And,
no,
and by the way, the question for both of you, I'd like to hear how both of you feel about that.
yeah, no, I would say no, it wouldn't imply. I would wonder, I'd be curious why you think it would imply that. I don't know if you want to say why real quick.
Well, if you replace every part of a server, and you move it,
Microphone.
Can't hear me.
if you keep talking about a car or some inanimate object that way, but I can take a computer and I can take the processors and I can take the memory and the disks and all that, and I can either get rid of individual pieces, and I would still identify it as that computer, that particular server. I could take that server and I could move all of the memory and every instruction and everything to a completely different server, someplace else in the world. And as an individual that's logging in that server, it's the same thing to you, even though all the parts are different. So is that a soul?
So I would say, first of all, I would disagree that it is the same. I think that when it comes to aggregates, which is a computer, a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure, I think the moment you begin to replace parts, it's no longer the same object. So I would disagree that the computer would be the same. That's why I talked about the car, tricycle. Even my friend Braxton Hunter talks about if I told you I had Christopher Columbus's axe, and you say, oh wow, let me touch it, and you're like, well, it is his axe, but I replaced the handle, I replaced this, I replaced that, and I replaced everything, then is it still Christopher Columbus's axe? Well, no, because everything's been replaced. So I would say the moment you begin to replace parts of an aggregate, you no longer have the same object.
You still have the same server. If I have a
Just one second, we can't hear you over there. You did ask Leo a question as well, so we're going to give Leo a chance to respond.
Wait, there was a question in there for me. If there was, I'm so.
Here,
You wanna know
come
your
up
thoughts
here
on
again,
it?
just real quick,
Oh,
just,
my thoughts on that same.
Yes.
I don't know a lot about computers. I would just say I don't think computers have souls, or humans, or anything.
Soulless.
And unless you listen to the right kind of music, then you've got soul. Or if you wear shoes, then you have two souls. Well, assuming that you don't have an amputated
I've got a
leg or
Kia soul.
something.
You have to like Jimi Hendrix, that's right. All
I remember you made a joke about that.
I've got a Kia soul.
I'm just curious, do you believe that animals have souls, and why or why not?
Yes. I can give you theological reasons or philosophical reasons. Theological, I think the Bible teaches it. Philosophical, I would argue that anything that has consciousness, remember there's two basic questions that are fundamental philosophy of mind when you get started. What is the nature of consciousness? What possesses it? I think that consciousness being immaterial would have to be possessed by an immaterial substance. Animals are conscious, thus I would say anything that's conscious is going to require soul to ground those conscious states.
I just want to say quickly, I think it's very consistent of you to say that animals also have souls versus people say, oh no, only humans can have souls because like we're special, which I do think humans are kind of special, but
Because we're made in God's image.
yeah, well, yeah, you can say that.
righty, let's carry on. Your question.
I just wanted to ask about like the evidences of like NDEs, but to formulate my question, I first start out by saying, both of you guys can answer this. I want to start out by saying thank you guys for coming and everything and engaging in the discussion. I think it was pretty good. With regards to NDEs, when the body dies and there's no more metabolic functions or anything like that going on, but people seem to have accounts of what they saw in like hospital buildings and or what they saw outside of the hospital buildings, how would like a physicalism perspective answer that, and then what would be your response to that as well, Eric?
Thanks for your question.
Thanks.
So for me, I would say that as far as you know with NDEs, there is CNS, central nervous system activity going on. I'm going to say long after death, but long is relative there because it's not like, 16 days or something like that. But there is still some central nervous system activity going on even after brain death. So for me, I don't think that it's literally everything has actually fully stopped working. Also, we have recreated both NDEs, near-death experiences for those who aren't familiar with the abbreviations and stuff, as well as OBEs, out-of-body experiences, using a variety of chemicals. I could cite a paper that shows how these chemicals react with certain receptors in the brain, chemicals that are created at death, en masse, and also at birth in the brain, and how these, when they attach to these receptors, can produce these effects. I'm sure nobody wants to sit here and listen to a 2.5-minute quote from a technical paper, so I'm not going to do that. But I encourage everybody, regardless of what you believe, to look into the literature regarding both near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences.
Yeah, I would fully agree with that as well, especially given the fact that a lot of NDEs are actually being peer-reviewed and published. So, for example, you have the Science of Near-Death Experience published by the University of Missouri Press. You have a lot of other NDE books being published. Near-Death Experiences is Evidence for Existence of God. Obviously, that might be a little biased, you might think, but Evidence of the Afterlife, Handbook of Near-Death Experiences, where you have substantial peer-reviewed, doctor signed off verified cases. There's a lot to say. I usually don't use this in my case for the soul because I don't think I need it. And I think it can go into a rabbit trail. But I definitely think when you look at some really interesting cases of people who have knowledge they should not have had knowledge of, or even cases where there was one, I believe, what's her name? Pam Reynolds, I believe, where she had this really rare kind of operation where they have to like put the body at a certain temperature to like almost freeze it. They have to turn her upside down, drain all the blood from her head. Then they put these things in her ears that are clicking to see if there's any brain activity. So you have this body at a low temperature, no blood in the head, and she describes almost to the T what the operation was like while she was under. And even to bring the person back, you have to slowly raise the body temperature back up, slowly put the blood in. You have a certain amount of time to do this, and then revive the person. She was able to describe all of that, so much so, if I'm not mistaken with this in particular, the doctor said that her explanation was so detailed, he could use it to teach a class on this rare operation. So I think there's interesting things to be said there, and I think, especially in a case like that, the brain is not working. You mentioned, if I can respond to what Leo said, so shameless plug, because I haven't said anything about it. I have a new book out called The Lazy Approach to Evangelism. A simple guide for conversing with non-believers.
I would like to read that. I've heard it's very good.
Oh, thank you.
Even from a couple of atheists I know who have read it, they have said it is a very good book.
I appreciate that.
So congratulations on it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You're nice. I like it. Now, I don't talk about NDEs, but I do mention one thing, because I hear this a lot, that we can recreate these out-of-body experiences, and there's something called the God helmet. One thing I say in the book is that it's like saying this: I can recreate experiences at the beach. So if you put probes on my head, tell me to think about the beach, and you'll look at what parts of the brain are lighting up. And then let's say Leo's never been to the beach. Well, I get the beach helmet, put it on his head, and I light up those parts of the brain. And now he gets this experience of being at the beach, although he's never been there.
I've actually never been to an ocean beach. So wait, one time in 1999 when I went to Florida. Okay.
Were you the same person?
You know what? Probably not. I think the beach changed me.
That's right, yeah. So the point is that just because I can recreate experiences of a beach, it doesn't follow, therefore, there are no beaches. So I think, and I'm not saying he uses this as an argument, but I do hear that put forth as a reductionistic type of argument that I think just doesn't work and is a silly objection.
A1. Thank you for your question. Thank you to our speakers. Your question. Come on up a little bit there, if you don't mind.
Oh, hey there. So one question I had a discussion with one of my friends a while back, and I saw this video a few years back of, I don't know how accurate it was or how authentic the video was, of a head transplant that they were thinking about doing. And so we had the question, if hypothetically there was a head transplant where you put one head, put it on another body, would that entail that the soul is in the brain or in the body? And this is a question for either of you guys, by the way.
Yeah, so that hasn't happened. That story has been going on for a few years. I know they want to try to do it. It's some guy in Russia has volunteered to be that candidate. I wouldn't, but they haven't even gotten close to doing it. But it's a good question. Now, I would say this. As I said earlier, I would say science has virtually nothing to say, or neuroscience, when it comes to these questions. But I do think there are some things that we can learn, or at least inductively conclude about the soul in an a posteriori kind of way. So that means after facts. There are some things you can know without leaving my chair. I can know that a triangle by definition has 3 points. But if I want to know whether or not it's raining outside, so triangle 3 points, that's a priori. That's before investigation. Whether or not it's raining outside, that's a posteriori. I have to get off my posterior. I've never used it. And actually go out and see if it's raining.
I'm going to start using that now.
I just thought of that right now. I got to write that down. Trademark. So all that to say is I think there are some things concerning the soul that I think, on my view, I hold to what's called a Traducian view of the soul, where you...
Can I ask you to say that word a little slower?
Traducian.
Okay, that's what I
as
thought
opposed to a creationist view of the soul. I don't want to go into those weeds and what's called organicism. Suffice it to say that, again, my body is so intimately tied with my soul, one of the reasons I hold to that view is because you look at something like starfish. If you were to sever a starfish arm, that arm has a capacity to become a new starfish. So you have a new substance coming into existence without reproduction. I think that's best explained, assuming substance dualism is true, on a traducian view of the soul, where essentially when you have that biological tissue is infused with what's called soulish totipotentiality, and when you have something coming together, like in reproduction, the soul, for lack of a better word, comes into existence and there's a substantial change. Something like with the starfish arm or twinning, when the embryo splits, I think that's explained on a traducian view of the soul as opposed to what's called a creationist view of the soul. Nothing like the debate you had earlier, but meaning that God has to specially create a soul every time a sperm and egg meet. All that to say is there are some things that we discover afterwards, but I think that the body is, the way I've heard Moreland put it, an external realization of an internal structure. Meaning that if you look at the kind of body I have, it actually tells you about the kind of soul that I am. It tells you about the capacities and potentialities that I have. So I could say I don't know. It may be that the soul is specifically dependent on certain functional neural systems or certain parts. So I don't know, but I definitely wouldn't want to be part of that experiment.
I mean, you mentioned about the starfish thing.
Yeah.
Would the mind still, would it be the same mind if it was on a new body, or would it be completely different, a different
Okay.
mind?
So he's asking about whether or not, because I know you didn't get it.
Did you want to come up and ask that in the mic by chance? I know we got a couple more questions here, and then we'll get wrapped up. But
So you mentioned a thing about the starfish and how when you sever its limb, it has the potential to grow into a new starfish. Now transferring that to the hypothetical that I said, if you put the brain or if you put the head on a new body, would that give you? Will you still retain everything, all the knowledge that you've had or the life that you've had, or would it be a whole different person?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say the short answer, I don't know. But again, that goes back to there are some things I think that you might need some a posteriori kind of investigation. But I would say that someone mentioned heart transplants, and they feel like, I think it was you, that feel like different persons. Think of the brain like a CD, if you will. Music is not inside of a CD. Like if I broke a CD, I couldn't shake out the songs, right? But what you have on a CD or like a record disc are grooves that, when put in the right retrieval system, will play certain music. I think the brain is somewhat analogous to that. So if hypothetically I were to get your brain and swap it out for mine, I think I would have probably different experiences because there's already certain grooves that come, the baggage, if you will, of grooves that come with that particular brain. I just don't think it's metaphysically possible that you could do that, but as a hypothetical, sure.
all right, your question.
Yeah, you say the soul's not a scientific, it's not investigatable through science, right? So, but
It's not a scientific question.
but you keep saying that the soul is intrinsic to our body or claims like that. So what is necessary about the soul for our bodies to function? And if the soul is necessary for our bodies to function, then that does seem like a scientific claim, and that it can be investigated by science.
So what I said specifically was it's not a scientific question. And one of my points was that for the most part, all views regarding in philosophy of mind, most views regarding in philosophy of mind are what you would call empirically equivalent theories, which means there's no amount of scientific data that could lend support to one view or the other. This is why one of the things I said this debate is not about are the correlations or cause and effects of the mind and brain. Because let's say you have brain damage and you lose memory, like say with Alzheimer's. I would argue that the soul, much like a musician using a guitar, there's a string that's been popped so I can no longer play certain notes. I would argue it's the same with the soul being embodied and certain parts of the brain being damaged. Or you can take a strict physicalist view and reduce it and say, well, no, the mind just is the brain. Or you can take a property dualist view and say, well, the mind is not physical, but it's still possessed by the brain, and this is why you have this problem. So you have three different views, all metaphysically different, but they all agree on the empirical data. So that was my point about
I want to say one thing if I can. I actually agree with Eric that the soul is not really an empirical question. Obviously he would disagree. I would say that's kind of a point against it. But I would compare it to something like moral realism versus anti-realism. I don't think that's an empirical or a scientific question either. I'm not an empiricist. I don't know if I don't think you are. but I would reject empiricism myself. Obviously, I'm sure Eric does. But I would agree with him that I don't think questions of the soul really fall within the realm of the empirics.
You had a clarification, did you? Or another question?
Yeah, I think logical empiricism self-contradictory. I'm not an empiricist, but not that I don't use empiricism to investigate the world, but it still seems like you're copying out a little bit when it comes to if there is some necessary requirement for the soul to exist for our bodies to function in some way, then that still does seem like a scientific claim that we can investigate through science. I'm not seeing, so it seems like to me that this, if it's not investigated, if you can't investigate it using science, then it's not necessary to believe that a soul exists for us to exist.
So, gonna pick this up again. I have 2 chapters in this book on what's called scientism. And I think that's what I don't know if you're familiar with
I
scientism.
am familiar. I'm not a scientismist either. I'm a naturalist.
Scientistic. Just so everybody knows, on the internets and in here, somebody who holds the scientist, I'm really sorry to interrupt.
Scientistic.
It's called a scientistic.
Okay,
That's the
thank
term.
you very much.
Again, I'm
So-
sorry.
No, it's all right. So scientism, you have weak and strong, but essentially they'll say that science is the only or best way to get knowledge about reality. I reject that epistemology. So I'd say if you're starting there, I would immediately disagree with you. And I have 2
I'm
chapters.
not doing that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, you just said that if we can't.
But it seems like you're making sort of empirical claims by saying that there's some interaction between the soul and the body.
Can I maybe steelman you to maybe try to give this up? And I might be able to just let me know if I'm accurate. I think Ozian might be saying something like, if the soul might not be something empirical itself, but if it's in some way related to empirical things like the body, then wouldn't that mandate some empirical aspect about the soul? Are you saying something along those
Yeah,
lines?
we should be able to make predictions based upon this empirical predictions based upon the soul existing, and be able to measure those results based upon the soul existing. It doesn't seem like we have to presuppose that the soul exists to investigate how our bodies work.
Well, no, that's not my case for the soul. So going back to again, the cases for the soul aren't necessarily predictability, so to speak. It's I have these basic. In other words, it's not a theory to explain something. It is just reporting the experiences I have. I can think about what I'm feeling. I can be in pain without knowing the neurological process. I would argue that that's an ontological distinction between knowing nothing about my brain at 3 years old and yet feeling pain at 3 years old. In other words, I'm not trying to predict anything. Nevertheless, on my view that the soul and body are deeply integrated, if you want to ask about predictability, then I would say go back to the empirically equivalent. Note I didn't say that it's completely irrelevant. Empirically equivalent just means that the empirical data you present to me or Leo, neither one of us are going to disagree with the empirical data. So I'm saying it's not relevant to settle the question, because no matter what empirical data you provide, both views are going to have ways of explaining it.
All right. We got any more questions? Yeah, another fellow's coming up here for another question. We'll get another one in
Is
here.
that an atheist Jesus fish?
No. Anarchist.
Oh,
Godarchy.
nice.
Evening, by the way. So I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to follow up with the context behind the question. As far as like what is consciousness and what can have consciousness, one of the other gentlemen brought up like networking as far as the transfer of information and everything. And I think a really relevant subject to this is AI. There's this YouTube channel called Dust, and they have these short Dust, and they have these short sci-fi movies that are like 15 minutes long. And in one of these sci-fi flicks, it has, and it's very relevant to today and increasingly becoming relevant. They're like on this ship, and there's this scientist, and he's got this patient, and he's like, all right, we're going to end your life as it is now, but you're going to live forever. We're going to download your consciousness into the computer. So we're going to take every single experience that you've had throughout your life. So in addition to the first questions, if you can download someone's entire consciousness, entire experiences, are they that same person? And if not, what is a consciousness as opposed to having a soul or not having a soul? Like, can AI have a consciousness? And then what's the difference between human consciousness and artificial intelligence and consciousness?
Yeah, it's a good question. Another shameless plug. I was on Capturing Christianity, and I have the video on my channel as well. I think I talked for about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours on AI and consciousness. So in other words, I can't fit it all within a few minutes. But But yeah, you're welcome to go there, but I'll say a few things. I don't think you could ever download someone's consciousness. I go back to the CD illustration. I could take a brain and put similar grooves on there, but I wouldn't call that downloading the consciousness. On top of that, I don't think AI could ever be conscious. An interesting argument against functionalism was actually presented by an atheist philosopher, John Searle, and he gives what's called the Chinese room argument. It's a fascinating argument. And essentially, in a nutshell, he says, suppose you're put in this box, and there are two holes, and you can't get out of the box, and beside you there's this book, and it says that whenever a piece of paper with the squiggly line comes in this side, then find the paper that has a squiggly line and pass it through the other side. Now let's suppose you get so good at this, you look at the rule book, and you get so good at taking in and passing out pieces of paper. You get so good at it that, it's just like, really quickly happening. Now, suppose that unbeknownst to you, what's actually happening is that people are sending in questions in Chinese, and you're responding with answers in Chinese. And suppose you got so good at this that to the outside observer, it looks like this box understands Chinese, when in reality, you don't understand a lick of Chinese. And his essential argument is that imitating conscious behavior does not entail consciousness itself. So while I think AI could get really darn close to imitating consciousness, that wouldn't prove that it is consciousness any more that the person inside this Chinese room imitating Chinese language shows that he understands Chinese.
So, question for the other side: would you believe that AI could have consciousness?
AI specifically, I'm not sure, but being a process functionalist, I would say that if every neuron I have was replaced progressively with a silicon chip that could do exactly the same thing, I would remain a conscious agent. So I think that if the proper processes and functions are in place, you can get consciousness. There's something else about what you asked that I wanted to respond to, and I don't remember what it was because my ADHD brain is terrible at keeping things.
Me too.
Yeah.
You talk about downloading consciousness and
yeah, downloading consciousness. Would you have different experiences? I would say yes, because you would be experiencing the world from being downloaded in a computer. Just like I think if I perfectly cloned myself, that clone would go off to have its own experiences and would eventually develop into its own person, who may end up disagreeing with me on things because it goes out and has its own experiences and builds its own beliefs and stances on things based on what it goes through, even though it was initially an identical clone of who I was. So I think that fits with my view. I think that makes a lot of sense. Obviously, I think he would disagree, but within my view, I think it makes sense.
Do you mind coming up and putting the question in the mic? We'll wrap this up right after this, though. This will be the last question, then we'll wrap her up.
So as far as consciousness is concerned, between AI and human, between what's organic and inorganic, what would you define as like, it's kind of difficult to think of one being conscious or one not being conscious or both being conscious, and then if they're both conscious, what's the implication of that?
Well, for me, the implication of that would be that we could sort of synthesize consciousness, which I think if we could do it. And with the silicon chips and everything like that, I was speaking more theoretically. Whether we ever actually do that, I don't know. But the idea that we could theoretically synthesize consciousness, I think, would be profound and probably be used for some bad things, because we're humans and we like to use really cool technology to do terrible, terrible things.
Any final thoughts on the panel before we close out?
Other than that, this was a great discussion, and I enjoyed it as much as I thought I was going to. No.
Excellent. That's what we like
My
to
soul
see.
is blessed.
All right, well, we're going to close it up there then, everybody. So anybody that's watching it online, hit the like button. We're going to be coming back with Aaron Raw and David Wood. You're not going to want to miss that. So anybody in this room right now, hopefully we'll see you in a couple minutes, and we're going to close it out. So big round of virtual applause for the speakers, everybody, and our in-house applause, of course. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next.
Subscribe.